All right, let's talk about the database building part. Okay, so I'm basically screen sharing Canva on top of a Canva presentation, and the reason for that is because I tried this before and it really messed it up. There was a previous version where I had to cut out a bunch of slides and videos, and it was not great. It was not a great experience. And so, what I want to do is kind of do a screen recording of a presentation because Canva sometimes does stupid stuff. So on this one, what we want to talk about is database and Supabase. It's just a couple of things to note that I feel like would have been helpful as I've been building out different projects on Bolt. It's just nice to know. Okay, so the first is wait for it. I prefer to have it take my time, to be honest. I see sometimes people have advice to jump in early. People have the temptation to jump in early. Just like they jump in early with deploying to Netlify. They want to establish their database early because it has some of those components to their product that they really want to understand of how they'll interplay with each other. My advice: wait as long as possible because when you do that, you don't let the schema breathe. And so, what I'd like to do is I allow, as I'm building out the product, for the product features to help build the schema versus having to update it all the time. So you'll see in some of the Bolt, Twitter feedback. You'll see it in some of the Bolt Discord where people are having really deep migration files. Like they're having a lot of migration files, and migration files are essentially something where you are changing something about your product, and it is changing how Supabase operates in relation to what your code from either StackBlitz or GitHub or Bolt itself, how it operates with Supabase. So it's basically, it'll say things like, hey, here's a way for you to calculate how this data point should operate with this data point within the database to serve up something to an authenticated user. Well, if you change how those data points interplay with each other, it requires you to have a what I guess is called a migration file update, where it essentially says, hey, Supabase, instead of how I told you that these points should interplay with each other, I'm going to change that so that data point A works with data point C and data point C operates with data point B. So we're just changing the order, but it requires a whole new migration file. And so, as a non technical founder, it took me a while to understand that was what was happening. And after building about 4 or 5 projects or 4 or 5 products on Bolt, I realized, wait, I think the problem is that people are getting really deep migration file lists that then they have to go through and refactor. And as a non-technical person, I don't know anything about. I know what refactoring is now, but I don't know a ton about how to do it or how to explain to ChatGPT or Claude to do it and then upload it back into StackBlitz, which I primarily work with Bolt, not StackBlitz. I don't have a GitHub. All these like different things that you have to do when you're just trying to put an MVP out there before you start really trying to recruit a CTO or something like that. It's all a lot. And so, in order to limit having to do those extra steps, it really helps to just wait. You see, I just said a bunch of stuff that if you're non-technical, you really don't have a lot of experience building products yourself, like hand-to-hand combat, individual contributor work. Everything I just said about schemas and refactoring and migration files and database all probably or might have sounded a little bit more like gibberish than it did like, oh, he's telling me stuff I already know. And if it does sound like gibberish, even more why you should wait for it because you don't want to have to deal with those things later. The same way that I had to learn what migration files were because I created too many and I did have to go through and figure out what the heck's a refactor? How do I implement it? First of all, how do I create it? Then how do I implement it? And it's a lot of steps you don't want to do. Much easier for you to just wait and let the product build out the schema. And then when you're finally ready to activate Supabase, you can do that as one of your last steps. Maybe even after you start pulling in Stripe for payments. The next thing that you want to do when you're dealing with Supabase is you want to check in. You want to, if you've activated Supabase, you want to make sure that as you're doing updates to new users, new features, new business models, you want to make sure that you are updating your schema. The schema is essentially it's kind of like a migration, but it essentially is how do these so if migration files, if you think of those as like rules for how point A, point B, and point C data points should operate and interplay with one another, and then surface that to the authenticated user. Think about your schema um, as what things about point A or data point A are numbers versus email versus text versus rich text versus a drop down within the row. Because you think of each data point as an individual table, you need rows, and each row has specific data points within those. And so you really want your schema to be set up really well, so that the information that are in each row or the columns of each row are actually working well with some of the stuff that will come out in the migration files. And that is going to be something that is really helpful later on, because if you by chance don't update your schema often, what will happen, and I've had this happen to me, what will happen is that Supabase will get confused about how a few data points should link up together, and it will start to essentially make educated guesses because you didn't update your schema. And therefore, you might end up with an outcome of a product experience that you don't necessarily expect or want. I'm not saying it will happen. I'm just saying it has a possibility of happening. And then you got to go back and be like, actually, I wanted the email validation to be on this lower, what would we call this lower table of information that the users have access to, not all the way in a completely different table that the users don't actually have access to, but the admin do. And so you really want to make sure that you are updating your schema religiously. The next is row level security. So this is actually something that it took me a while to understand what was happening, and it was from reading the migration files and just being like, okay, what is row level security? So sometimes you'll have an issue where you're running a test of a product after it's being deployed, and you will see an error that happens, and it usually has to do with like a user trying to access something that they're not supposed to access, or a user doing an action that is not resulting in the outcome that you anticipate for what your product should do. And a lot of times, what will happen is that it'll say something like an RLS error. It's a row level security area error, and is essentially saying that this user is not allowed to interact with this data in this way. And a lot of times where you will find how your row level security is being told that it's supposed to operate is in those migration files that I mentioned a few slides ago. So if you're really curious about how your product is set up from an RLS standpoint, like go through the migration files and you'll actually see like how people or authenticated user or even unauthenticated users are going to interact with your product and how they're going to be allowed to interact with your product. One of the things that we know with reference one is that users should not be able to see candidates or job positions from any other user if they did not upload those candidates or job descriptions themselves. However, in order to not have duplicate candidates, what we will have is that a candidate will have a candidate ID. So more than one user can use a combination of actually, let me put it this way. If multiple users are putting in the same first name, last name, and email, that means that the interface knows to accept that information, add it to their profile, but in the background, find out what the candidate ID is for that like combination of three data points. So that means that a candidate can be associated with different employers, but it doesn't mean that it has to have a new candidate ID for every employer for that candidate. Sounds complex, but in reality, I want to create a situation where a candidate can eventually have multiple people viewing their references and their reference scoring without having to set up different profiles for each employer to access. So all that to say is the row level security of that means that it's going to be a little bit weird, because a simple way of saying that is that an employer can only access the candidates and the jobs that they have available and that they've uploaded. What I'm trying to do is immensely more complex. I'm basically telling the database to run a search function on the back end, not in front of the employers, but on the back end, because they shouldn't know that a candidate is in our database, because that would expose the candidate's private information, because then they would be able to search through the database itself. So the row level security is a user cannot go through and search for our candidate in our database, because that might surface other candidates that they could then just pull into their own job hunt, even against the candidate's wishes. So row level security means that they can't access all of our candidates. However, it does mean that on the backside, when they do enter a candidate, it goes into our database. So again, it kind of gets technical when you explain it in a way that is not that is driven by personal experience, because what I just said might just sound like I'm ranting and raving, but in reality, when you experience it yourself, you'll start to realize how row level security works for every new project that you build. And that's how I am right now. This is all learning. Another thing that I found is that local versus database. I just ran into this recently, as in yesterday. And so that was actually the reason why I want to do this video. And it essentially says that sometimes you will be doing things in local and you will be thinking that you're doing things in the database. And therefore, when you're running a function, it will spin off errors. For some reason, Bolt is not smart enough to know what you're trying to do. So it will spin off errors, but it won't tell you what the errors are. And it usually will have something to do with when I experienced it, it was with working with reference one, and it was saying that the organization does not exist in the database. And I was like, what are you talking about? I'm literally looking at it. I just added the organization. How is that even possible? Fine, then got pissed off, removed organizations from the entire product, and then later went to put in a candidate and tie it to a job that I put in. And it was like, job doesn't exist in the database. And I was like, what? The candidate's in the database. How's the job not in the database? I'm looking at it right now. And then I went into the code and I read it and I went, oh my gosh, the jobs and the organizations were in local. The candidates were in the actual database. So when I was asking the product that I had already deployed to test out to attach a candidate to a job that I could see, the job that I could see was hosted on my local, which is on your computer, and the candidate was hosted on the database. And those two don't talk to each other. I did not know that. Again, not technical, but it is something to watch out for. So if you use local hosting at first, before you use Supabase, which is an easy way to not spin up a Supabase product, is that you run everything locally. Make sure that everything then gets turned over to the database. Not one thing or two things. Don't make sure that it knows that everything is being turned over to the database. Last thing, and now this video is long, I know. I'm really just trying to help, I promise. Supabase pricing. So one thing that I did not realize is I knew that I was trying to work on a couple different projects and just kind of figure out how they all work, and figure out how Supabase works in different contexts. And I saw that it was free up to 3 projects. So I was like, oh, well, if I do a paid project, I can get unlimited projects. That's great, because at 3 projects, you have to suspend every project over 3 in order to stay free. I was like, okay, cool. If it says if I pay it, then the paid aspect of it will allow me to do unlimited projects. What it does not clearly state is how it works, which is when you pay, it's not that the 3 projects that you used to have for free are now free. It actually means that each one of those projects is $10 per month to even be alive. So you are essentially getting $30 worth of value in the free tier that when you start paying, you lose $20 of it. and then you have to pay $30. It is the weirdest pricing I have ever seen in my life. And the only reason that I continued paying in the paid tier is because I had like 6 projects I needed to work on. But it essentially means that you have to earn enough money, or if you're working for an agency or something like that, you have to charge enough money to equal that $10 a month, because that's a minimum. That means your database will always cost a minimum of $10 a month. Now, the first database, they give you $10 back. That's like a credit that they do. But I was so surprised that on the free tier, I could have 3 live projects for free. But on the paid tier, those 3 projects cost you $30 a month. Like automatically, before you even pay for the subscription to the actual platform, just having the 3 alive and not suspended is $30 a month. And I wish that they would explain that better. So that's it. Hopefully that's helpful. It's kind of a deep dive, or really just a modern understanding for non-technicals to understand how Supabase and database works when it comes to Bolt. Sorry it was so long. I hope this is helpful.